Hi, and welcome to Total Rewind, a Filmmaker's Compass podcast where we discuss movies from 30 years or older and see if they still hold up. I am D-Man, joined by CP. Very excited for our episode. As always, how you doing over there, CP?
Good. Are you ever not excited to be talking about movies, though, D-Man?
You know, it's hard for me to not find the energy to just discuss any movie at all. I don't care if we're talking about, a kid's movie or, Citizen Kane, whatever it is. It gets me amped up because there's so much art and effort that goes into every movie that I can't help but want to talk about it.
No,
That's the reason why I think, honestly, if, little side note right here, that's why we watch movies with other people, is because we want to talk about it afterwards. And so if there's anything that this podcast does, it's allow us to talk about these movies that we've enjoyed and got a chance to watch with you. So I'm really excited. And today's Total Rewind, we're going to be talking about Animal House. So I'm going to throw it over to you. Tell us a little bit about Animal House and kind of where we're going with this episode.
Okay. Animal House is the infamous 1978 American comedy from John Landis, starring a number of amazing comedians who would go on to be, first and foremost of which is John Belushi. It was written by Harold Ramis. And also, awesome note is Ivan Reitman was one of the producers on the film. Also Ghostbusters.
Yeah. What's funny is when you look at the stable of actors, producers, directors, everybody involved in the film, they actually collaborated a ton throughout the rest of, I think, the 80s, maybe even the early 90s, and then they all kind of separated. But when you think about where all these people come from, they were part of SNL, they came from comedy troupes, but they were all connected. And it's pretty crazy to see them all kind of converge on what is a classic comedy film and actually kind of enjoy their work in the beginning, because some of their stuff, some of their best stuff later, Groundhog's Day, Ghostbusters, some of those movies, they all came out a little bit later.
Yeah, this is one of the early things. Obviously, I think this is the first film kind of coming out of the National Lampoon brand, which all of these people, including John Hughes, were involved with, and so many influential comedy geniuses really kind of came out of this workshop. So it's cool watching the film and seeing the people who were involved so early on.
Sure, and even talking about John Belushi, I mean, I would say Animal House, after standing the test of time, is probably his most popular film.
Classic Belushi.
Obviously,
Belushi.
Blues Brothers, we know him for that. And they had I think they had a Blues Brothers show at Universal at one point. And that legacy had kind of carried on. But I'd say in the last maybe 10, 20 years, the Blues Brothers has kind of faded from our collective consciousness. Mm-hmm. But Animal House has not. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm really pumped to talk about this, because it's a movie that, as old as it is, I think we're looking at almost 45 years now.
Yeah.
It's still around. And to that end, it's worthy of being on Total Rewind.
So, absolutely.
Yeah. If you want to go ahead and kind of preface, we had talked about this in a pre-production meeting. We wanted to address a little bit about the film and how it's aged.
This movie has not aged well. And audience, if you have not seen it or you've not seen it in a while, you'll be a little shocked upon revisiting it about how much of the comedy really does not hold up based on our modern standards of what's funny and what's acceptable. I think the biggest case in point is there's sexual assault. There are jokes involving rape. There is a scene involving rape or the perceived rape. Jokes that are based in racism and homophobia. And those things modern audiences aren't really going to have a taste for in, I guess, the way that people in the 70s did.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, in the sense that when you look back, right, some of the jokes, it's almost ironic that they were so comfortable to tell them because you knew they would get a laugh in that time. Mm-hmm. And now, yeah, like you said, we're just in a different era. And we find a lot of those things offensive rather than funny. And that's where the movie kind of falls, is those jokes are a product of their time, and they played well to the intended audience at that time. But as we've grown, as we've matured as a culture, generally speaking, those jokes have not aged well, and we no longer find them necessarily funny.
And I think one of the biggest areas of contrast here is when we look at something like Blazing Saddles, which we looked at a few weeks ago.
Right.
Blazing Saddles is through and through a satire, and you understand that there's a lot of greater narrative going on, that, you know, these Mel Brooks and these storytellers are talking about life in the 70s, race relations. There's a very high level conversation going on, and there's definitely elements of satire in Animal House, right? Vietnam War, Nixon,
Right.
you know, the Nixon presidency, they're referencing issues at Kent State, but it doesn't have the overarching sense of satire that the whole film's wrapped up in. So those jokes really stick out as much more relics of the past than as high level artistic comedic genius filmmaking in some ways.
Yeah, the jokes play as they're lowbrow jokes.
Mhm.
They're done for a laugh, and there's not necessarily an intention behind those jokes to reveal or be insightful in some sort of unique way with the audience. Right? It's not a dialogue. You're like, no, it's played for laughs, and
Mhm.
it's at someone's expense, and that's kind of how they fall. That's why they don't age well, because there's not this kind of like thoughtful look at you know culture on campus, or homophobia or rape. They're not It's not self-aware to that degree, where we're like, hey, these, they're clearly trying to point out something,
Mhm.
and to that end it's just played for a laugh, and they haven't aged well.
So if we push that aside and just let's look at the cultural impact of this movie, because
Okay.
it's definitely there. This is a movie that, well, most people are aware of, and the references and the references to it still persist to this day, which is pretty amazing for, you know, a nearly 45-year-old film.
Yeah, and what blows me away is when you think of Animal House, it's hard not to obviously think of Greek culture, right?
Mhm.
Fraternities, sororities, but also college life. I feel
Mhm.
like the movie has endured because every year there's a new crop of people that are going to college, that are joining fraternities, joining sororities. And it's hard not to, kind of want to indulge a little bit and have fun and look back at what past generations had a good time doing. So Animal House is one of those kind of staples, right? I think, another good example is if you go, so I'm from South Bend, Indiana. If you go to Notre Dame, how can you not watch Rudy? It's like you have to do it. You have like an obligation by going to Notre Dame to watch Rudy. Like that's just, you got to do it. And I feel like Animal House is one of those films where, there's a lot of kind of college flicks. We discussed pre-production, Van Wilder, Old School, which is borderline. It's not a remake, but it's definitely inspired by Animal House. And there's these college flicks that it's like you got to watch them if you go to college. You just, how can you not?
Mhm.
So
Absolutely.
in terms of cultural relevance, I mean, the movie will endure past this podcast episode. I mean, it's going to be around. And I wanted to ask you something. Now,
Mhm.
when it comes to Greek life, what do you think the effect of Animal House was on like Greek life?
Oh, I think it's funny. You know, obviously my Greek experience, and there's no such thing as a typical Greek experience. When we were in college, in undergrad, Animal House was very much the perfect example of what not to do in a Greek fraternity. And the universities, the national, you know, chapters were very clear, like this is not what we're about. We are constantly fighting against this idea that this is what fraternities are, which
Okay.
I'm I mean, obviously we weren't in college in the early 80s, but I would imagine in some ways after this film came out in the late 70s, that may have shifted
Sure.
Greek culture into this is what we aspire to be, just this complete recklessness and overindulgence, um, which
And people probably take inspiration from the movie and then they take it to the next level in real life. And then we've heard the stories which, are tragic to that end, of pledges that were forced to do way too much. There's actually been pledges over the years that have passed away. I mean, truly tragic scenarios. But even just looking at Animal House, and nothing of the sort happens in that movie. It's funny, like it's a good time. It's just hard not to see the influence that, everybody references Animal House. I bet even when you guys talked about it in Greek life, it was like the Animal House effect.
Yeah. I mean, if you are going Greek and you tell your friends or your family you're going Greek, the first question is like Animal House. When you are holding rush events, you always have pledges come in, or potential pledges coming in, talking about, is this going to be like Animal House? And to that effect, a lot of the major changes that we've had in recent years,
right,
looking at, the zero tolerance for hazing, the way that we rethink our approach to Greek life, to the pledge process in general, I think is a direct result to the Animal House effect.
Well, I think that in and of itself is Animal House's lasting legacy, but there is also the opportunity to mention that if I had to ask my dad, or maybe even your dad, what one of their favorite comedies are, Animal House might come up.
Oh, I think absolutely. Absolutely.
So something else to make note of is that, this makes, generally, when you look at kind of comedy lists and, how people perceive the film, not necessarily in the terms of College and a Greek Life, just as a movie, it's a lot of people's favorite comedy.
Well, case in point, right? This movie is listed on a number of the premier lists of best comedies, AFI, Bravos. I know it was inducted into the Library of Congress as a film, which is, considered significant, culturally relevant. So you're absolutely right.
Other than that, there are a couple of lines in the film which I think still hang around in our lexicon today, like double secret probation.
Or may I have another, sir?
Yeah. I'm a zit.
Yeah.
Like, those things have stuck with us, and they're not necessarily over. Obviously, something else, if you go to any college campus, there's always a toga party. And I'm not saying Animal House invented the toga party. They did not. But they popularized it to
exactly.
another level.
Yeah.
So those type of elements, I mean, it has such a lasting legacy as a movie, and its influence on college and kind of our culture. It's if I had to give the film, out of all the things we're going to talk about today, culture is where this movie stands tall.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Crazy. The influence it's had is just crazy.
Totally.
So let's move into, normally we talk about effects, but we'll talk about the soundtrack right now. We'll talk about some of the jokes and some of the production values of the film as a movie, and not necessarily, getting into those other elements. What do you think? What really stands out to you? Like, is there a sequence where you're like, wow, that was actually really cool? They're doing something unique here. What stands out?
Oh boy. I still, in my mind, I think one of the smartest things that they did from a comedy perspective is there's a lot of scenes where they just let John Belushi own the scene, own the space. One of the best examples of that is, I think about the one where he's at the lunch line and he's stuffing all the food in his mouth and on the plate.
Yeah.
And it's a hilarious scene. And the reason why that works is because the director said, hey, this is Belushi. We're just going to let him take this to the extreme, be totally Belushi on it, shove more food in his mouth than is humanly possible. And we're just going to track him and go with it. And it's just going to seem never ending. And as you watch that sequence, it still holds up. And I think it is hilarious. And it was because they said, we're just going to stay with him, right? If it was a static shock or if they were cutting around, it wouldn't have had the same effect as us walking through the cafeteria with Belushi as he's, preparing to be a zitlet,
Sure. And I mean, I think, something that stands out is the cinematography is, kind of fairly standard. There's not a lot of effects or things going on. But I mean, if we were to remove the actual joke, there is a scene where there's like an angel and a devil on someone's shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I actually thought it still looked pretty good. That wasn't something that took me out of the movie or, really, I guess, aged poorly to the degree that I couldn't, right, get past the effects.
Yeah.
And I don't know, there were a few scenes, they do all kinds of, at the end, they have that kind of, they're in the float in the parade.
Yeah.
I thought it all aged actually really well. A lot of practical stunts.
Yep.
For the people. It's weird because we don't always think of, I think as moviegoers now, we think of stunts like, Indiana Jones, like somebody's got to be
Mission Impossible.
dragged behind like a car or something. But there's a lot of stunts that go on in this movie where people just fall off things.
True.
But somebody's got to do that.
Floats, ladders, yeah.
Horses. Somebody's got to fall off this thing or, whatever. And that's not as easy as it sounds.
Good point. Very good point.
I mean, I found it pretty believable. In terms of soundtrack, this isn't necessarily, I think you and I talked in pre-production, this isn't Fast Times at Ridgemont High,
mm-hmm.
right? The soundtrack is not necessarily that memorable, but it was good.
Yeah.
Like I enjoyed it. And again, it is a product of its time, as most of these movies are that kind of take place in, the real world.
Yeah.
They're representing the time they're in. And I didn't find the soundtrack to be a detriment at all. Although, again, we often bring this up. There wasn't really like, I guess, quote unquote, a theme song or anything that kind of sticks with you.
No. What it is it's a collection of a lot of great kind of 50s and 60s rock.
Mm-hmm.
And they tied it together with some brilliant scenes. And they're, if you're flipping the radios or, you're on shuffle on Spotify and one of these songs comes up, immediately you think of these scenes. And that's that's a testament to some good writing, some great music selection. And you have to wonder, is the scene memorable because of the song or is the song memorable because of the scene? And in some of them, I don't know. Like, again, the cafeteria scene with the, that don't know much about history song. I don't know which came first.
Chicken or the egg. Well, another element of the film that is worth bringing up is, do you think anyone was, I guess, miscast? Obviously, John Belushi stands out as the kind of star of the film, even though he's not even technically like the main character.
No, Bluto's very much a secondary character.
Right? Like he's not even the main character. I did not, watching it, upon rewatch, I did not find anybody that I thought was necessarily like miscast. Was that something that you came across? Because I felt like, everybody seems to do their role well.
Yeah, I mean, it is weird watching it now 40 years later and seeing some of these characters and saying, I'm kind of surprised that you didn't go on to be a more recognizable star.
Sure.
But no, I think you're right. There's no casting issues that really seem to blow your mind.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, John Belushi, like we said, this will most likely go down as his most memorable role.
I mean, dude,
so
the man smashing a guitar on a stairwell, like that's probably one of my favorite scenes ever.
His speech steals, the movie. Like that inspired, impassioned speech is, what really brings the whole thing together and really rallies the troops, right? That's what brings us all to the finale.
Yeah, exactly.
But to that end, let's talk a little bit about the story, because this is probably where I have my actual qualms with the film. And that is, the story itself, I felt, is not all that strong. It feels like a bunch of scenes, and then maybe like they get their kind of like justice or revenge at the end, but it didn't have, I guess, traditional arcs, and it doesn't really leave you with any sense of having like, some sort of lesson or anything insightful necessarily come your way. It's kind of like, just don't let the assholes get the better of you.
Yeah, it's really weird. And watching it again, you're totally right. Essentially, it is a 20-minute short film that really everything comes together during that sequence with the dean where they are put on suspension.
Right.
The rest of it leading up and the rest of the movie leading up to that point is a series of comedic vignettes that some of them are funny, some of them aren't incredibly funny. And the movie, I think part of the reason why the story is so seemingly non-existent is because where most characters grow and change and transform, in this film, they say, hey, this is who we are. We're going to just dig our heels in and refuse to change
Yeah.
and be
They just double
ourselves
down.
to the
Yeah.
very end.
They double down and say like, hey, you know, no one's going to change us. And it shows because I that was probably the number one thing upon rewatch that stood out to me was the story. Yeah, it's kind of non-existent. It's like these guys are coming in, they want to pledge for a fraternity. They don't get into whatever it is, the Omegas or whatever the other fraternity is. And they end up coming here. And it was just weird because nothing really happened.
They go on their adventures in the life of a Delta.
Yeah, you know.
And then they decide to crash the parade and to stick it to the dean.
Right. You know, like, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess. And it was a fun ride, but it wasn't necessarily a story that, you know, inspires much in the viewer, I guess.
No, you're absolutely right. And there's not a lot of change from the characters. And as an audience, we're like, okay, cool. So assholes, you know, you can't let them have the last, laugh.
Exactly. That's how I felt. Yeah.
And that's kind of it.
That was the moral of the story, was just like, don't let them get the last laugh.
Because you're right. It's not like they redeem themselves and save
I don't even
charter.
think the fraternity makes it. I think they're done, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I don't know. It was just one of those things that, you know, I guess when I was watching it when I was younger, I hadn't, because even you look at something like Old School, right? Which takes a lot of the same plot points and reapplies them. But Old School is speaking to these guys as kind of adults. There's a lesson in there that is addressing like, hey, you got to grow up sometime. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
well, I think another good example is kind of comparable is Van Wilder, right?
Yeah.
Van Wilder is living the Delta life and he decides, hey, like, you know, partially because the university's forcing him, but he says, okay, now I have to grow up and graduate.
Right. And there's this sense of adulthood. Like, hey, this is always great. And we hope everybody that comes through this phase in their life enjoys it. But you got to grow up. And that's kind of what the other films are getting at, where Animal House, I did not get that vibe. I mean, it kind of feels like they're like, hey, you know, if we could, we would. And we would just keep going because it's awesome.
And you bring up a good point. I think it's important because I think college is such a transformative period of your life.
Sure.
And it's weird in the sense that you're an adult, but you're an adult with a pass, right?
Yeah, yeah.
The pass is I'm in college. You can make mistakes that would not hold up in the real world because you are in college. But college ends and then we become real adults. Right. And most college stories deal with that transition, that growth, going from entering college as a pretend adult to leaving college as a real adult. Yeah. And this movie ignores that very important component of the college experience.
Yeah. And it stands out. I mean, I guess all I'm saying is I could feel it. So is that bad? No, it's not bad. The movie is still funny. It's still entertaining. Like you said, even though it plays a bit as a bunch of vignettes, like they work. You know, it's like I enjoyed myself. It's just that I wasn't left with some profound knowledge that like, oh, okay, you know, I get it. And I guess, you know, the movie has a kind of timeless, enduring quality because of the things we talked about earlier with culture. So, you know, maybe it didn't need it. And maybe I'm being overly critical, but it felt like an element that was, if I had to pinpoint where I felt the movie was at its weakest, I would say it was with the story.
Well, and I think the other component that we didn't talk about, which does sort of tie back into the cultural importance of Animal House, is this is really the first major shock comedy, right?
Yes.
60s, the motion picture code was thrown out, and suddenly filmmakers said, hey, we can put anything we want.
We can show toilets, you know.
What are the limits that we can push here? And
people can fart.
Right? When you look at this movie, they are doing the ultimate that they can from the gross out shock comedy film, right? You know, you have a dude doing push-ups in dog poop, and they have people puking on people, and they have people spitting on people because there's zits, and there's hand jobs, and there's talks about, talking about sex, and there's smoking weed, and which at the time, I'm sure that this movie was
no one had ever seen it. Yeah.
Provocative film ever created in history. I mean, I'm pretty sure there's a line where doesn't the demon say something like fucker?
Yeah.
And you're like, wow, okay. And so a lot of the story, I think, is kind of, hey, how can we cram as much of this controversial stuff into a movie and still get away with it?
Well, to that end, they succeeded. Yeah.
But in some ways, I think that what's weird is I think for modern audiences now, we have kind of become desensitized to that. As you said, we've seen Superbad, we've seen Animal House, we've seen Animal
Old
House,
School,
we've seen American Pie, Old School, Van Wilder, Harold and Kumar, movies that have taken the Animal House level and really tried to up the ante. Hangover, right?
Yeah, no, it's a good point because, a few weeks ago we talked about Jaws, and, one of the components of that discussion was that at one time Jaws scared people out of the water. Mm-hmm. They literally didn't go in the water. But as time has gone on, we've seen other movies like Jaws. We've seen, kind of people taking it up a notch and all this different stuff. If you were to show people Jaws today, I don't think a lot of people that are, actual movie goers, movie watchers are going to be scared by Jaws to get out of the water. Does that mean it's not a good movie? Of course not. We came to the conclusion that it's a great movie as it stands, but the effect it had at that time was pretty crazy. And I think Animal House kind of fits into that box where it's like, at that time, all these things were new. They were fresh. No one had seen it. They're pushing the boundaries. They're making people uncomfortable. But yeah, once you've, now you're 45 years later, you're like, I mean, we've seen this stuff.
Right. So I got to ask you, what's your take? Does it hold up? Does it not? How do you think 45 years in this case later, what's your perception of Animal House watching it again?
Well, the number one thing, like I said earlier, that stands out to me from Animal House is its cultural impact. And it's huge. I mean, the movie, it's not often that movies 45 years old. Now, granted, movies have only been around for 130 years or whatever it is. 130. What am I talking about? 110. The point is it's a small sample size to see how long movies last. But for 45 years, this movie gets played every year. And this is a movie that I'm someone who goes to parties. I like to party. You go to parties, you go places. This movie's on the TV. In the living room, a perfect example is kind of like a Superbad, where they're at some house party and, you can imagine a TV being somewhere and they have something on in the background. It's often Animal House or Cheech and Chong or, some of these older things they just put on to have on. And I'm like, Animal House still gets played. And that really just hit home for me with this, where when I look at, the movie, and I take a look at how has it aged? Did I really enjoy the story? Those elements were a little bit weaker. Mm-hmm. So it was a little bit of a conflict for me to decide yes or no. Does this movie hold up? And simply because of its influence on college and Greek life, I think I'm going to have to say it does.
Okay.
Now, granted, again, addressing what we talked about at the top of the episode, a lot of jokes we say does this movie hold up? There's a lot of stuff in here that doesn't, right? And that's just how we've grown. but its influence is just so big that it's hard for me to ignore it. And I have to say that, I think this is a movie that's going to be around. It's not going to end here. And, you think of John Belushi, it's Animal House.
I mean, that's true. Like, you can't think about John Belushi without mentioning Animal House. And you can't talk about college. If you're talking with your niece or your nephew or a cousin or whoever about going to college, naturally someone is going to reference some moment in Animal House. It's just the culture we live in. Watching it again, I guess I feel that despite the cultural impact, I don't know if it holds up as a movie. Our expectations now for comedy, for jokes, for even the gross out factor, right? What Animal House did to gross us out is not the same thing that we get as audiences now, almost 50 years later. And I just think that for a lot of moviegoers, I don't think it holds up in the same way. And I think if I was to watch it with a teenager now, I don't think that they would find it funny. I don't think that they'd get the jokes. And I don't think that, or I guess I think that because they've been spoiled by so many other great comedies, which were inspired by Animal House. And directors' clear attempts to kind of pay tribute to Animal House. I think that there's just some comedies that have done it better that are worth seeing in its place.
No, I get it. I mean, like a scene that comes to mind is in 40-Year-Old Virgin when they're, he picks up the girl at the bachelorette party at the bar and they're going home and she ends up puking all over him. And he's like, "Did you have shellfish tonight?" And she's like, "Yeah. How did you know?" He's like, I can tell. They've just taken it up a notch. I feel that because, unfortunately, I think, like I said, my decision lands on its cultural relevance and how impactful it was. But at the end of the day, as a movie, it's a little tough.
Every Greek meeting that I was in with the university was someone referenced this can't be an Animal House type situation. So trust me, I get it. The impact still matters to this day and it's relevant. Just real quick, I want to take this moment to give a shout out to your wife, Steph. We heard her partying in the room next door.
Oh yeah. She's just watching TV, but I'm sure hopefully having a great time. So, that actually does wrap up this episode. And I want to throw it to our listeners. I want to ask you guys, what are your thoughts? Did you love Animal House? Does it hold up? Is it something that you think future generations will love? And be sure to let us know. Comment on our social media posts and on YouTube. Give us your thoughts.
Did we miss the mark?
What do you mean?
No, I mean, like, I'm asking the audience, did we miss the mark? Is there some comedic genius or something that we have kind of swept under the rug? Let us know what you think.
Exactly. And be sure to follow along. If you haven't, I'm assuming you found the podcast, but if you haven't already, be sure to actually follow us. We're on all the major social media. You can subscribe on YouTube, and then we have the show listed on all the major podcast directories. So be sure to look us up. You can Google us, Filmmakers Compass Podcast, and all of our links are on our website. And thank you, everybody, so much for tuning in. We appreciate you guys listening. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. And like I said, keep it going.
Next week, we're going to be talking about the John Hughes classic, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, 1987. One of the best comedies ever made. Lots to talk about. That's all I got.
I love 80s movies, so I can't wait. I'm pretty sure I'll be excited. So
you usually are.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.